"500 men sailed west with ambitions. 4 men walked east with a story." Chapter 3. Where Narváez vanished, Vaca walked, tracks the spectacular unraveling of a commander who, when asked for orders at the moment of crisis, essentially said, "Every man for himself," and then let a night wind carry him into oblivion. Stick around because the Greek sailor, the stone anchor, and the 8-year walk across a continent are all waiting just below the waterline. Safe indoors after navigating the flooded beach outfall, watching the Gulf churn, it is easy to mock the catastrophic resume of Pánfilo de Narváez. This was a man who had already been thoroughly embarrassed by Hernán Cortés in Mexico. That encounter cost Narváez his dignity, his freedom, and one of his eyes. Yet, in the grand tradition of failing upward that defines so much of human administration, Narváez did not view 1526 as a time to retire. He viewed it as a time to annoy King Charles V until he received a promotion. Tracking this timeline reveals a deeply bureaucratic tragedy. Narváez was chasing the ghost of his own relevance. His stubbornness proved to be a dangerously flawed navigational tool, and what followed was a comedy of errors written in blood and salt water. The paperwork, at least, was impressive. On December 25, 1526, Charles V granted Narváez the capitulación. This was a formal royal permission slip to conquer La Florida, a territory early maps optimistically described as stretching from the Rio de las Palmas in Mexico to the Cape of Florida. Narváez was named Adelantado. This title sounds magnificent, roughly translating to the one who goes before. In practice, it usually meant the first person to die in a coastal swamp. His orders required him to build 2 towns and 3 forts. The catch? The crown refused to pay for any of it. Narváez had to fund the entire labor himself. He scraped the cash together by calling in debts and gambling with the careful investments of his wife, Maria de Valenzuela. He was effectively betting his family's survival on the speculative fiction of undiscovered gold. To ensure the crown received its cut of any theoretical wealth, Narváez appointed Álvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca as royal treasurer. Bringing a tax collector on a suicide mission is a special kind of administrative irony. It ensured that even in the face of starvation and ruin, the ledgers would be mathematically sound. The expedition launched from Sanlúcar de Barrameda, Spain, on June 17, 1527. 5 ships carried 600 soldiers, sailors, wives, and enslaved Africans toward a rapidly crumbling destiny. Upon reaching Santo Domingo in Hispaniola, reality made its first rude intervention. About 140 men heard the local rumors regarding Florida, likely horrific campfire stories about the failed Aylon expedition, and promptly deserted. They were the smart ones. Those who remained sailed on to Cuba, where nature clarified its position against them. While Narváez was busy recruiting replacements in the autumn of 1527, a hurricane struck the fleet. The distinctive sound of snapping timber during a Caribbean cyclone is the audio signature of human ambition dismantled by physics. The wind turned the sea into a grinding mill, sinking 2 ships and claiming 60 men and 20 horses. This devastating blow forced the survivors to winter in Cuba. They spent the months licking their wounds and buying new boats. By February 1528, the Grand Armada was reduced to roughly 400 men and 80 horses. Everyone looked toward the horizon with justifiable apprehension. Then came the incident with the pilot. In early 1528, Narváez hired a man named Miruelo. He was touted as a very fine pilot of the northern Gulf Coast. Given the outcome, the standard for expertise in 1528 was set comfortably on the floor. 2 days after leaving the port of Jaguar, the entire fleet collided with the Canarreos shoals. This was not a subtle grazing of the hull. The Canarreos archipelago is a jagged maze of reefs southwest of Cuba. Miruelo drove the fleet directly into the limestone teeth. For over 2 weeks, the ships sat stranded. The supplies were already meager, and they were slowly consumed by men who had nothing to do but stare at the shallow water and regret setting sail. Keels scraped the bottom constantly. The friction ground down the morale of the crew along with the wood. Salvation arrived in the form of another threat. A storm matched the intensity of the tides, and a strong wind blowing from the south raised the sea level just enough to lift the vessels off the jagged embrace of the reef. They escaped into open water, battered and terrified. They had been saved by the exact chaotic weather that usually destroys fleets. It is a strange paradox of exploring the unknown. Sometimes the incompetence of the guide is so profound that only a natural disaster can correct the course, even when that correction pushes the survivors deeper into the danger of the Gulf. Gold's Gambit, a Florida fiasco. The Gulf's powerful currents treat human ambition with absolute indifference. For the remnants of Pánfilo de Narváez's fleet, roughly 900 miles was a rounding error only in astrophysics. Carried north by the Gulf Stream, the Armada discovered that the water cared nothing for their formal plans to land near modern-day Tampico, Mexico. Instead of the Rio de las Palmas, they spotted land off the west coast of Florida on April 12, 1528. After a couple of days of fumbling south and losing yet another ship, the expedition crunched ashore in what is now Boca Ciega Bay. The party was severely diminished, down to about 400 men from its original 600. This was not the designated destination, but it was, finally, ashore. Narváez was a man whose supply of confidence always exceeded his supply of food. He took one look at the humid, swampy landscape and decided it was unsuitable for settlement. First, however, he had to complete his paperwork. The day after landing, on Good Friday, he gathered his men and formally claimed the entire country for King Charles V. He then read aloud the requerimiento, a document explaining in academic Spanish that the local inhabitants must convert to Christianity or be subjected to war. This declaration was delivered to an audience of uncomprehending pine trees and sand fleas. It possessed all the legal force of a squirrel declaring ownership of a bird feeder. The actual inhabitants had already fled in their canoes, leaving behind empty, beehive-shaped houses. One of these structures was large enough to host a modern wedding reception. While the governor occupied himself with his royal proclamations, his purser, Alonso Enriquez, engaged in a slightly more practical form of diplomacy. He rowed to a nearby island and managed to trade glass beads and tin bells for fresh fish and venison. It was a promising start. Back in the abandoned village, the Spaniards found a small gold rattle. To a man like Narváez, this was less a charming toy and more of a giant flashing neon sign that read, "Gold nearby." A few days later, a party sent inland stumbled upon more conclusive evidence. In a village at the head of the bay, they found stacks of Castilian freight boxes. Inside each box was a corpse wrapped in painted deerskin. The expedition's commissary, a friar named Juan Suarez, looked at this makeshift cemetery and quickly concluded it was an act of idolatry. He promptly ordered the whole collection burned. With that fire, he neatly incinerated what was likely the only existing physical evidence of Ponce de Leon's failed 1521 colony. This discovery of salvaged European goods inflamed Narváez's ambitions. He captured the local chief, a man named Uchita, and demanded to know the source of the gold. When the chief could not, or would not, produce a treasure map, Narváez acted out a fit of management pique. He ordered the man's nose chopped off and had his wife thrown to the dogs. It is hard to overstate the breathtaking cruelty of these men, who operated with a savagery that would make a cornered wolverine blush. You do, however, have to note Narváez's single-minded commitment to his brand. His diplomatic masterstroke complete, Narváez made his final, fatal decision. He relied heavily on rumors of a gold-rich province called Appalachian to the north. He also made a tragically incorrect guess that his original Mexican destination was only a few dozen miles away. Based on these flawed theories, he ordered the expedition to split. On May 1st, 1528, he would march inland with 300 men and 42 skeletal horses. The ships carrying the remaining 100 or so souls were ordered to sail up the coast. They were to meet him at a large, safe harbor that the pilot, Miruelo, swore he knew. The royal treasurer, Cabeza de Vaca, objected immediately. He pointed to the lack of food, the pathetic state of the horses, and the fact that they were marching into a complete geographic mystery. Narváez was unmoved. To protect his honor, Cabeza de Vaca was forced to join the land party as it disappeared into the Florida jungle. There was no large, safe harbor. Narváez would never see his ships again. Seeking gold in Florida did not make him a conquistador. It merely made him the best-funded man to ever vanish into a coastal swamp. Fatal flotilla, a Floridian folly. To vanish properly into a coastal swamp requires a striking lack of preparation. Stepping away from the beaches, the land party carried rations suggesting their quartermaster was either a strict minimalist or simply held a grudge. Each man received exactly 2 pounds of biscuit and a half-pound of bacon. The journey instantly dissolved from a glorious imperial conquest into an aggressive, large-scale foraging operation. History benefits from being told backward, ideally reconstructed from the safety of a dry vacation rental. For the men of the land party, there was only the flat, endless misery of the present. For 2 weeks they waded through a landscape of rivers and marshes that seemed drawn by a cartographer with a profound disinterest in dry ground or viable landmarks. They found no houses, saw no people, and survived primarily on the hearts of palm trees. That specific diet reads much better on a modern coastal bistro menu than it does while standing waist-deep in a damp Florida thicket. Their march marked the first European penetration of the interior, defined less by scientific discovery and more by the slow, grinding realization that they were utterly lost. Hostility, when it finally arrived, provided no welcome break from the monotony. At a river crossing that was plausibly the Withlacoochee, about 200 locals met them. The inhabitants were understandably unenthusiastic about the armed intrusion. The resulting skirmish left Spanish men and horses wounded, perfectly establishing the tone for all future diplomacy. Making matters worse, Narváez pursued a foolproof method for alienating the only people who actually knew how to navigate the terrain. He pillaged meager native storehouses and took an Appalachee chief hostage. The governor clung to the campfire gossip that had driven his fatal decision, stubbornly expecting the northern province of Appalachia to be brimming with gold. He envisioned another heavily centralized Tenochtitlan. What his men actually found near modern-day Tallahassee was a town of 40 thatched huts, occupied mostly by women and children. The fabled imperial capital was a quiet farming collective. They had chased the promise of unlimited wealth and arrived at a 16th-century community garden. There was no gold. They were left with nothing but heavy armor, crushing disappointment, and the unnerving hum of summer insects. By late July, the expedition functioned as a walking catalogue of tactical failures. Sickness and festering wounds spread through the ranks. Appalachee archers stalked their movements, firing arrows that punched through Spanish metal with infuriating efficiency. In August, Narváez ordered a retreat south to the coast, aiming for a village named Aute. They limped in to find the settlement abandoned and burned. Its surviving gardens, however, still held a harvest of corn, beans, and squash that provided a brief pause from outright starvation. From this charred refuge, Narváez sent Cabeza de Vaca and 50 men to find the open water. They found it at a dreary coastline of shallow water and oyster beds near the Wacula River. There were no sails on the horizon. The truth settled in like a coastal fever. The ships were gone for good, and the safe harbor promised by their pilot had always been an illusion. Faced with a hostile shore, dwindling calories, and the grim specter of cannibalism, the surviving officers agreed on a plan built entirely on desperation. They would forge their own tools, construct crude barges, and row away from the Panhandle. They had to launch into the Gulf currents and pray that back in Cuba someone was already funding a search. Maria's Folly, a Florida fable of fortune and fury. Someone in Cuba was indeed funding a search. While Narváez and his starving band were busy transforming their stirrups into nails and their shirts into sails in a desperate bid to reach Mexico, a completely different drama was unfolding back in civilization. This rescue effort was driven by the one person competent enough to actually run a logistics network, Narváez's long-suffering wife. Maria de Valenzuela was a woman of rank, considerable wealth, and the patience required to manage an absentee husband. During Pánfilo's earlier career, which included a long stint locked in Hernán Cortés's prison cells, Maria had not been idle. She managed gold mines and livestock with a shrewdness that highlighted her husband's military blunders. Her accumulated fortune financed the Florida debacle in the first place, and when Pánfilo failed to return with the changing seasons, she did not retreat into mourning. Instead, she mobilized her own armada. She purchased 2 brigantines and staffed them with a crew she hoped would possess a better sense of direction than her spouse. As luck would have it, the only name associated with knowing the Florida coast was Miruelo, the same family name as the pilot who had originally driven the expedition onto the shoals. Driven by necessity, Maria hired Diego Miruelo the Younger to captain the rescue mission. Hiring a Miruelo to navigate Florida waters carried the same logistical logic as hiring a pyromaniac to guard a library, but options were limited. To his credit, this second Miruelo actually managed to sail a brigantine straight to Tampa Bay, locating the very site where the main expedition had vanished. He found the missing harbor, he saw the beach, and he spotted a split reed stuck in the sand with a piece of paper wedged inside. It was a siren song of bureaucracy left by the vanished explorers. The note proved to be the undoing of Juan Ortiz. An 18-year-old civilian with the invincibility complex common to teenagers, Ortiz volunteered to row ashore and retrieve the message. The rest of the crew urged caution. They correctly suspected that the indigenous locals, having previously lost their noses to Narváez, were understandably hostile to returning ships. Ortiz and a companion ignored the warnings, stepped onto the sand, and walked toward the reed. As they reached for the letter, the trap closed with brutal efficiency. Warriors led by Chief Hirihigua swarmed the beach, killing Ortiz's companion instantly and seizing the boy. Upon seeing his crewmate bludgeoned and captured, the captain made a swift executive decision. He cut his losses. Proving that panic was a family trait, Miruelo the Younger turned his ship around and fled back to Cuba. He confirmed that Narváez had landed but successfully abandoned Ortiz to a fate worse than drowning. Dragged before Hirihigua, a chief who held a highly justifiable grudge against Spaniards, the boy was condemned to a decade of horrors. He was forced to run endlessly, beaten, and finally bound to a wooden rack over a roasting fire. He was spared only by the intercession of the chief's wife and daughters, who argued that executing a mere boy would not bring back the chief's nose. Ortiz eventually fled to the neighboring Mocoso tribe, where his burn scars healed into permanent markers of his exile. He blended into the native culture, maintaining an existence that was horrifyingly secure. Decades later, his published adventure account plausibly inspired Captain John Smith's story of Pocahontas. Ortiz would remain in cultural limbo for 11 years, scanning the horizon for a rescue ship that was already long gone. Hundreds of miles away, the very men responsible for his terrifying exile had completely exhausted their land options and were preparing to abandon the Florida shore altogether. Resin and rafts, a Gulf gallop to destiny. While Juan Ortiz began his decades of coastal captivity down the peninsula, the men responsible for his tragic exile were executing their desperate plan to turn weapons into watercraft. On the bug-choked banks of the St. Mark's River near present-day Tallahassee, Pánfilo de Narváez's grand colonial ambition underwent a rapid and humiliating downsizing. The gold was fictional, the ships were lost, and the only empire being built was a frantic assembly of dying men staring at the Gulf of Mexico. By August 1528, the expedition was in a state of logistical collapse. Battered by Appalachian arrows and their own misguided marching orders, the 242 survivors had retreated from the interior. Starving, decimated by disease, and lacking the technical knowledge to build a basic boat, they made a decision born of delirium. They chose to consume their own transport to build an escape. Civilized society typically curses vandals for defacing public monuments, viewing destructive impulses as the opposite of culture. Vandalism, however, when viewed through the desperate lens of survival, is just aggressive reformatting. To construct the rafts necessary for escape, the Spaniards vandalized their own martial identity. Their makeshift forge utilized a bellows ingeniously crafted from deer skins and hollow wood. Crossbows, stirrups, spurs, and iron helmets went into the fire. The tools of conquest were melted down and beaten into saws, axes, and nails. It was a heavy metal transformation, turning instruments of war into the fasteners of flight. Bypassing the proverbial burning of bridges, they simply melted their swords to build a ferry. A crew cannot sail on nails alone. The barges required watertight seams, and the expedition faced a severe shortage of oakum and pitch. Enter Doroteo Teodoro. As a Greek Christian sailor, Teodoro was a demographic anomaly in this Castilian crusade. While the Spanish nobility knew how to demand gold, Teodoro knew how to read a forest. In the coastal wilds of the Panhandle, he realized the local slash pines operated as vertical factories of waterproof glue. He tapped the trees for resin, manufacturing a pitch mixed with palmetto fiber to seal the seams of the 5 crewed vessels. His specialized knowledge of naval chemistry proved so vital that Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca reverently refers to him as Don Teodoro. In the rigid hierarchy of the 16th century, bestowing a noble title on a Greek sailor is the historical equivalent of knighting the IT guy, because he is the only one who knows the Wi-Fi password. Teodoro was technically the founder of North America's naval stores industry, though he likely would have preferred a ham sandwich and a ticket to Havana. By September 22, 1528, the labor concluded. 5 rafts, each roughly 33 feet long, bobbed low in the shallow water. Teodoro's pine tar caulked the seams, and sails sewn from the men's own shirts provided the rigging. The launch initiated a slow-motion catastrophe drifting west. Overloaded with roughly 50 men per raft, the gunwales cleared the water by barely 6 inches. As they pushed off from the St. Mark's area, Gulf currents and coastal geography dictated their path. To reach Spanish outposts in Mexico, they had to skew westward, hugging the northern rim. This trajectory guarantees that this flotilla of misery drifted directly past the sugar-white dunes of what is now the scenic 30A corridor in South Walton County. It is a jarring historical juxtaposition. Today, this stretch of coastline presents a manicured geography of pastel beach houses and upscale brunch spots. In the autumn of 1528, it was a wild, indifferent gauntlet. As the starving conquistadors gazed at the coastline, they saw no vacation destination. They saw a beautiful, sun-bleached tomb, the brilliant white sands mocking their thirst as they drifted toward the sunset. Thirst and treachery, a fleet's folly. I stood on the balcony of my condo overlooking those same sugar-white sands, watching paddleboarders glide across the emerald water. The transition from survival to recreation is jarring. For the men on those 5 makeshift boats, launched from Appalachie Bay on September 22, 1528, this placid coastline was just the unavoidable first leg of an agonizing escape. Don Teodoro, the Greek sailor who formulated the sticky sealant keeping their rafts afloat, had already cemented his status as the expedition's indispensable man. Now he was about to face the next, less celebrated chapter of his career. Navigational sages estimate the rafts spent 3 or 4 days inching past this exact stretch of South Walton County. A singular, brutal agony defined their journey. They were dying of thirst. The water bags fashioned from horse legs proved to be a masterclass in desperation-fueled artisanship, but they suffered from a fatal flaw. The bags were made of rotting flesh and soon melted into a putrid, useless ruin. This logistical failure created a historical irony of exquisite cruelty. The 30A corridor is famous for its coastal dune lakes, rare bodies of mostly fresh water that sit just yards from the Gulf surf. The survivors floated almost within sight of a free, all-you-can-drink water supply. But the dark, tannic water, stained by pine needles and vegetation, likely looked like swamp runoff. In their dehydrated delirium, the Spaniards probably assumed it was just more useless ocean. About a month into the ordeal, the sheer physical suffering yielded to a specific disaster. In late October, the men steered their pathetic flotilla into an unfamiliar estuary. Their eyes scanned the shore for anything that was not salt. They spotted a canoe. The locals paddled out. They approached Governor Narváez's lead raft seemingly without fear. Through a frantic pantomime, Narváez asked for water. The natives agreed to help, but they required the Spaniards to provide containers. This request presented a severe problem. The soldiers only possessed clay pots scavenged from previously raided Indian villages. Losing them would critically set back their chances of survival. At this impasse, Don Teodoro stepped forward. Having already proven his genius in the field of naval chemistry, he apparently decided to add cross-cultural hostage negotiation to his resume. Teodoro insisted on going ashore with the natives to ensure the transaction succeeded. He did not go alone. He took an enslaved African sailor, a man whose name history never bothered to record. Narváez and the other officers tried to talk the Greek out of it. They correctly sensed the plan was deeply flawed, but Teodoro remained determined. His earlier success with the pine tar had made him a man of status. That victory had minted the currency for his unassailable confidence, a self-assurance that he was about to fatally misplace. The natives accepted the terms and left 2 of their own men behind on the rafts as hostages. Night fell. The canoe eventually returned. The natives brought the Spanish clay vessels back, but the pots contained no water, and the 2 Christians were gone. It was a vicious psychological taunt. The Spanish hostages had been sitting uncomfortably with their captors all evening. They heard their people call out from the canoe and immediately tried to leap into the water. The bearded soldiers held them tightly back. The canoe and its occupants then simply turned around and rowed away into the darkness. Historians place this grim transaction somewhere near the entrance to Pensacola Bay or Mobile Bay. The Spanish were left, in Cabeza de Vaca's understated words, very despondent and sad. They had lost 2 men and their scavenged clay pots, and they still had nothing to drink. Poor Teodoro's diplomatic shore leave had quietly become permanent. Lost Horizons, a navigator's unwritten requiem. Miles away from where Teodoro vanished into the darkness with his scavenged clay pots, another tragedy of incompetence was unfolding out on the Gulf. While Narváez's raft-bound survivors drifted past the dunes of the Emerald Coast and the deep coastal forests, the expedition's supply ships were engaged in a maritime disaster of their own. This was a separate but equally doomed odyssey. It was piloted by Diego Miruelo, a man whose confidence sat in strict inverse proportion to his navigational success. Miruelo had built a career on claiming to know the Florida coast. It was a boast that proved about as structurally sound as a sandcastle in a hurricane. Narváez had split his forces based entirely on Miruelo's promise of a great harbor nearby. This rendezvous point existed vividly in the pilot's imagination, but remained notably absent from the actual geography of the Gulf. When ordered to pilot a brigantine to this specific anchorage, Miruelo realized too late that his memory of his 1516 voyage was less a reliable map and more a loose collection of geographical hunches. Finding a latitude based on a decade-old guess does not make a sailor a master navigator. It makes him the accidental architect of a 300-man disappearance. As Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca later grumbled with the restrained fury of a man walking into starvation, Miruelo had already erred and did not know where we were nor where the harbor was. That error toppled the entire imperial venture. Yet, in a rare twist of competence, Miruelo managed to execute a backup plan. He dragged his shame back to Cuba, located a fifth ship commanded by Álvaro de la Cerda that actually carried provisions, and returned to the Florida coast. Thus began a year-long scour of the shoreline. The fleet sailed heavily up and down the peninsula, fueled by the retrieved food and a desperate hope that the land party would simply emerge from the mangroves. The psychological toll of staring at empty beaches eventually caught up with them. Knowing your own inability to read an astrolabe is the primary reason hundreds of your colleagues are currently butchering their horses proved too much for the pilot. He did not die of scurvy, starvation, or a well-aimed Appalachian arrow. He simply collapsed under the weight of his own botched resume, securing his legacy as a man whose reputation outstripped his actual skill. 16th-century professional embarrassment was evidently a fatal condition. Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo's history records the grim reality of the pilot's end without fanfare. He fell into such a profound melancholy that he died. Out on the water, blissfully unaware that their promised rescue fleet had succumbed to depression, Narváez and his emaciated crew continued their desperate drift westward. Sea's fury, Narváez, lost and unfound. Solely reliant on the improvisational genius of desperation, Governor Pánfilo de Narváez found himself staring at the Gulf of Mexico not as a conqueror, but as a man commanding a flotilla of kindling. Standing somewhere past the sandy edges of the Florida coast in the late autumn of 1528, one imagines the Adelantado surveyed his domain with the grim realization that he had successfully converted a mighty imperial expedition into a drifting, homeless shelter. For a month, the rafts bobbed westward. The Gulf had other plans. As they approached the mouth of the Rio del Espiritu Santo, what is now the Mississippi, they encountered a current so violent it treated their crude vessels like driftwood caught in a torrential outfall. The freshwater torrent shoved them unceremoniously out to sea, proving that while you might claim a territory on parchment, you cannot negotiate with grand-scale hydrology. By early November, cold north winds descended, turning the near-shore waters into a chaotic churn. It was here, amidst heaving swells and howling gales, that the grand hierarchy of the Spanish Empire finally dissolved into salt spray. The royal treasurer, Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca found his own raft drifting dangerously close to his commanders. He shouted across the waves. He asked for orders, for a plan, for some final shred of that legendary Castilian resolve. Pánfilo de Narváez was finished. He looked across the water, perhaps fueled by a deep, unspoken desire to simply stop being the person in charge of a damp, floating nightmare. He yearned to shed the heavy mantle of his rank and just be a man who could sleep without someone asking him where the food was. He shouted back that the time for orders had passed. "Let each man save himself," he declared. It was a management philosophy that, while efficient, is generally discouraged in naval emergencies. Narváez then decided to exercise the last perk of his status. While the rest of his crew suffered on the exposed shore of the Texas coast, the governor anchored his raft in the surf using a stone. It was a piece of geological security roughly as effective as trying to moor a galleon with a pebble. He granted himself the luxury of sleeping on board, wrapped in his cloak, accompanied only by a helmsman and a page. In the dead of night, the north wind noticed a raft secured only by a rock and good intentions. Quietly, without the pomp or circumstance befitting a governor, the vessel was blown out to sea. Narváez did not wake to the sound of trumpets or the clash of steel, but likely to the silent, terrifying realization that he was alone in the void. He vanished into the gulf. He was a conquistador conquered not by armies, but by a nap. The supreme final irony was an ecological one. The man commissioned by the crown to govern the land was ultimately claimed by the water. The Spanish bureaucracy maintained a legendary ability to generate paperwork, but the ocean remained entirely indifferent to permits. And while the governor drifted into the abyss, his remaining officers were left to wash ashore and face a continent entirely on foot. Lost shores. A new world's reckoning. Drifting was precisely the problem. I stood knee-deep in the surging, tannic outflow of Redfish Lake and watched the fresh water tear a jagged wound through the quartz sand to reach the Gulf. I felt a profound kinship with poor nautical judgment. Just as the currents here were dictating our unexpected route back to dry land, the Gulf Stream had already rendered its final verdict on Narváez. The governor vanished into the squall, issued that famous final dictate of management consultancy, "Save yourselves," and left his command to face the consequences alone. Narváez was gone, resigning his commission via accidental solo voyage. This left the remaining rafts to be tossed like dice by the Gulf until they washed up near Galveston Island in November 1528. Cabeza de Vaca, the royal treasurer turned reluctant survivalist, christened the place La Isla de Malhado, or the Island of Misfortune. It was an accuracy in branding that few modern marketing departments could hope to achieve. Of the approximately 80 men who crawled out of the surf, shivering and soaked, the winter would leave only 15. The cold was brutal. Having been to the island in the dead of winter, I can attest to the bitter cold. The hunger was a distinct, devouring madness. It reached a point of such grim necessity that on the mainland coast, 5 Spaniards camped in a separate enclave turned to the ultimate taboo. They consumed one another systematically until only one man remained. He lived presumably because there was no one left to eat him. The indigenous locals were understandably horrified. It is a supreme historical irony that the people the conquistadors labeled savages were the ones looking on in shock as the purported ambassadors of civilization turned their companions into an exotic flavor of jerky. What followed was an 8-year odyssey that transformed the expedition from a failed military conquest into an extreme pedestrian tour of the American Southwest. The survivors were whittled down to the famous 4 ragged castaways, Cabeza de Vaca, Captains Alonso del Castillo and Andrés Dorantes and Estevanico, an enslaved Moor from Morocco who possessed a talent for languages that likely saved them all. The 4 men were initially enslaved by Coahuiltecan nomads. They survived their captivity, eventually escaped, and executed one of history's most successful career pivots. The title of conqueror was a massive resume gap in this region. Recognizing this, the men reinvented themselves as shamans. It was a rebranding effort of staggering genius. They blew breath on the sick and recited slightly confused Catholic prayers, achieving a celebrity status that allowed them to travel with entourages numbering in the thousands. They did not conquer the land to survive. They survived the land to conquer. They walked. They walked for an estimated 2,400 miles, traversing the prickly expanse of Texas and northern Mexico. They became the first non-natives to see the American buffalo, noting the beast's humped back and woolly temper. They were also the first to document the opossum, a creature that looks like a rat designed by a committee that could not agree on a tail. The juxtaposition in my mind between my family's frantic scramble to get back to the condo for dry towels and these men walking naked across a continent was stark. We were fleeing a ruined afternoon. They were fleeing the very concept of death. By early 1536, the 4 men stumbled upon the first physical proof of Europe they had seen in nearly a decade. They found a Spanish horseshoe nail and a buckle. It must have felt like finding a discarded Starbucks cup on Mars, hard evidence that the aliens had arrived, and they were messy. Shortly after, near the Sinaloa River, they encountered Captain Diego de Alcaraz and his band of slave raiders. The reunion manifested as a tense standoff of ideologies, rather than a joyous embrace of countrymen. Cabeza de Vaca was appalled to find Christians burning villages and enslaving the very populace that had revered the castaways as healers. The indigenous followers of the 4 survivors refused to believe that these sun-baked, barefoot shamans were of the same breed as the violent raiders on horses. The natives insisted that the castaways came from the sunrise and healed the sick, while the raiders came from the sunset and killed the healthy. It was a scathing performance review of Spanish colonial policy delivered by the people it was designed to exploit. The formal journey concluded in July 1536 when the 4 rugged walkers arrived in Mexico City. They had taken 8 years to travel a distance a modern flight covers in hours. Along the way, they witnessed the brutal realities of a continent. They resembled Odysseus washing up on the shores of Ithaca. They returned as altered men, stripped of their initial swagger and burdened with the heavy, invisible cargo of survival. Their first-hand witness to colonial violence planted a seed of doubt. That experience would soon force a ferocious moral reckoning regarding the people the empire sought to govern. Conscience's crucible, a chaplain's radical turn. That eventual moral reckoning over colonial violence proved a heavy spiritual meal, one best digested while staring at a wall of water. Safely ensconced behind the impact-resistant glass of my rental condo, I watched the subtropical deluge attempt to erase the horizon entirely. The storm provided a fitting backdrop to contemplate the brutal vacuum Narváez left behind in the Americas. To truly understand the origin of that vacuum, one must look away from the governor's watery grave and toward the man who practically danced on it. Bartolomé de las Casas. If history is a dinner party, Narváez was the guest who broke the furniture and set the drapes on fire. Las Casas was the one standing in the corner documenting the devastation for the authorities. Before Las Casas became the sharpest critic of the Spanish Empire, he was an enthusiastic participant. He began his career in the New World aiding the conquest of Cuba, serving as a chaplain and an organizational accessory for Governor Diego Velázquez. During a pacification campaign to Camagüey, Las Casas found himself casually escorting Narváez. The veil of civility lifted in 1513 near the village of Caonao. Narváez's troops, acting out of boredom or simple wickedness, slaughtered hundreds of peaceful natives who had arrived bearing food. The scene Las Casas recorded is a historical nightmare, yet the immediate aftermath played out in bureaucratic absurdity. Wiping his blade, Narváez effectively asked for a local performance review. "What do you think about what our Spaniards have done?" Narváez inquired. Las Casas delivered a blistering reply that ruined the mood for the remainder of the march. "I send both you and them to the devil," he shouted. While Narváez was busy cementing his reputation as a villain, a legacy that would eventually see him washed out to sea on a raft of desperation, Las Casas was undergoing a remarkable transmutation. It wasn't a sudden lightning bolt, but rather a slow-burn epiphany that culminated in 1514. While preparing a sermon for Pentecost, he stumbled upon a verse in the book of Ecclesiasticus. It's not a story the Jedi Protestants would tell you, regarding the bread of the needy. It struck him that the entire colonial enterprise was a spiritual Ponzi scheme. He gave up his indigenous laborers, returned them to the governor, and decided his new life, quote, would be speaking truth to power, or at least shouting at power until it drafts new legislation. One cannot help but draw a line from this protective act back to Las Casas. After returning to Spain in 1517 to regale the court with tales of New World horror, prominently featuring Narváez as the antagonist, he engaged in a decades-long campaign of aggressive pamphleteering. His greatest hit, the short account of the destruction of the Indies, or La Brevissima Relación, for those who prefer the original vinyl, was published in 1552 but written earlier to terrify Prince Philip II into righteousness. The relentless lobbying was successful. It produced the new laws of 1542, which officially abolished native slavery and curtailed the rights of the ruling settler class. Las Casas became the moral antithesis to men like Hernando de Soto and Francisco Pizarro. He was not without his own massive flaws. In his blind zeal to save indigenous bodies, he painfully miscalculated by suggesting African slave labor as a temporary alternative. This mistake inadvertently accelerated the racialization of the Americas before he finally realized the universal nature of human rights years later. Despite this grave error, he stood firm in the Valladolid debate of 1550. Arguing against the finest legal minds of Europe, he maintained that indigenous peoples were rational beings capable of living en policía, governing themselves, and deserving of equal treatment. Did the Spanish court truly listen, or did they simply tire of the noise? Narváez chased gold, lost his army to a continent that refused his terms, and vanished into the Gulf anchored to a stone, while the man he appointed treasurer walked roughly 4,000 miles and came out the other side having learned something about survival that no capitulation could grant. The real insight here is that the expedition's collapse wasn't just bad luck or bad navigation. It was the logical result of treating an unknown continent as a stage set for personal ambition, where the map in your head outranks the ground under your feet. Wry footnote. Cabeza de Vaca objected to splitting the land and sea forces, was overruled, and then spent 8 years proving himself right. Next chapter. A wealthier, better-connected Spaniard studies exactly what went wrong with Narváez and decides the solution is to do it bigger. So ask yourself how many lessons a person can absorb before the lure of Florida gold simply dissolves them. If you enjoyed this journey, the complete travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon, Conquistadors and Condos. And if you want to come behind the scenes and get bonus content, you can join the community on Patreon.